there are very real differences between the United States and Russia, and I have no interest in papering those over. But there are also a broad set of common interests that we can pursue. Both countries, I believe, have an interest in reducing nuclear stockpiles and promoting nuclear nonproliferation. Both countries have an interest in reducing the threat of terrorism. Both countries have an interest in stabilizing the world economy. Both countries have an interest in finding a sustainable path for energy and dealing with some of the threats of climate change that we've discussed. So on a whole range of issues, from Afghanistan to Iran to the topics that will be consuming most of our time here at the G20, I think there's great potential for concerted action, and that's what we will be pursuing. Now, as has I think been noted in the press, a good place to start is the issue of nuclear proliferation. And one of the things that I've always believed strongly is that both the United States and Russia and other nuclear powers will be in a much stronger position to strengthen what has become a somewhat fragile, threadbare non-proliferation treaty if we are leading by example, and if we can take serious steps to reduce the nuclear arsenal. I think people on both sides of the Atlantic understand that as much as the constant cloud, the threat of nuclear warfare has receded since the Cold War, that the presence of these deadly weapons, their proliferation, the possibility of them finding their way into the hands of terrorists, continues to be the gravest threat to humanity. What better project to start off than seeing if we can make progress on that front? I think we can.
Adam. Both people do not act. The option of doing nothing is not available to us. And I think we've seen from past crises, both internationally and in regions of the world, that if people fail to take the decisive action at the beginning, then you risk a longer recession, you risk more businesses being lost, you risk more jobs lost. So of course these are difficult decisions because governments are moving in where markets have failed and banks have collapsed. But to take these decisions is the right course for the world economy. Now, I believe that the degree of international cooperation that we can get will determine how quickly all our economies can recover. If there is stimulus in one country and it's repeated in another country and repeated in other countries, then you can magnify the effect of that stimulus around the world, both for the benefit of the individual country that's making it and for the rest of the world. And if you can see the coordinated cuts in interest rates coming together, then you've got a push for recovery and for new economic activity. And if you can see the banks which operate internationally being cleaned up in every country, then you have a situation where the world will feel confidence and there will be trust in the banking system for people to resume saving, investing and preparing for the future. So I believe the level of international cooperation will be one of the major factors that will determine how quickly we can recover. But what we are determined to do is, in this difficult time, protect people in the jobs, make sure that we can get money to mortgage holders and to businesses, and of course make sure that countries that are in peril at the moment, who don't have their own resources and are unable to restructure the banking systems, are given resources from the world to enable them to do so. So the way forward is not to do nothing. The way forward is to take the action that's necessary.
I agree with everything that Gordon said. It's been said repeatedly that every financial crisis comes to an end. So it will come to an end at some point. The question is, what have been the costs and how long the downturn? I think people should take heart from the fact that governments have learned lessons from the 30s. Central banks have learned lessons from the 30s. There has been much swifter action, much bolder action, much more coordinated action even prior to this summit than we have seen in previous financial crises. And that means that the prospect of restoring world growth and trade are that much greater. I do think that Gordon's absolutely right. How well we execute in the months to come, how well we button down these regulations, how well we each in our own respective countries help banks to deal with the impaired assets that they have on their books so that they can start lending again to businesses and consumers, how effective we are in managing huge outflows of capital from emerging markets and provide a buffer for very poor and developing countries that are seeing huge contractions in their trade and just don't have a lot of margin for error, how well we reform our international financial institutions so that they can be a more effective player in this whole process. All those things will help determine whether this ends up being a slow-rolling crisis that takes a lot more time to cure, or whether we start seeing significant recovery. I don't think there's any doubt that 2009 is going to be difficult. And again, when you put a human face on this crisis, the way people experience it most immediately is losing their job, losing their home, losing their savings, losing their pensions. And what I think each of us is committed in doing is to make sure that people are getting immediate help, even as we're solving these broader structural problems, because we don't want that kind of suffering, but it's also not good for the overall health of the economic system, and that's part of where stimulus has been very helpful. I mean, in our own country, the unemployment insurance, the food stamps, the other mechanisms that have put money directly into people's pockets, that's not just good for those individual families, it's also helped to lift consumer spending, or at least stabilize consumer spending in a way that will promise better growth in the future. So I think that each family's got to look at its circumstances and make those determinations. Obviously, there are a lot of people who are concerned about their job security, or they're concerned about seeing their savings having diminished if they were in the stock market. And I think it's an understandable response to be somewhat cautious in the midst of this kind of uncertainty. I think the best advice I would have would be to say that despite the current hardships, we are going to get through this, and so you should plan sensibly in anticipation that this economy is going to recover, and young families are going to want to buy new homes, and sooner or later that clunker of a car is going to wear out and people are going to want to buy a new car. And so that basing decisions around fear is not the right way to go. We are going to get through this difficult time. And I think it is sometimes important to step back and just have some perspective about the differences between now and the Great Depression, when there were no social safety nets in place, when unemployment was 25 or 30%. I mean, this is a difficult time, but it's not what happened to our grandparents' generation. And so, I would ask people to be confident about their own futures. And that may mean, in some cases, spending now as investments for the future. There's been a debate back home about our budget. In the midst of this crisis, should we deal with health care? Should we deal with energy? Should we deal with education?